Okay, so now that we've looked at the three main reasons for the Civil War, three main causes, sectionalism, states' rights, and slavery, we have to look at one more. And it's kind of a combination of all three of these. And it's actually the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Now, before 1860, before 1856 even, the presidential elections had been based on the candidate themselves. And people had voted on who they wanted to be president based on the specific person. But starting in 1856, there was the first time that all of a sudden this idea of sectionalism starts to bleed over into politics. And people started voting for the candidate that their region was going to vote for. So, or more specifically, they voted for a candidate that believed the same thing about slavery as them. So, people in the South voted for a pro-slavery candidate, and people in the North voted for a anti-slavery candidate. So, for example, in the North, they were mostly Republicans because, in general, Republicans were against slavery, wanted to end it or stop it from expanding. And in the South, most people were Democrats because they wanted to protect the idea of slavery and allow it to continue. Now, all of this leads us into the election of 1860. And one of the things that had happened right before that election was the Dred Scott decision. And I know we just recently talked about it. But remember, the Supreme Court decision for Dred Scott said that all of the territories in the western part of the United States were now going to be open to slavery, and the people who lived there were going to get to decide whether slavery was allowed because the Supreme Court had decided that the U.S. government was not allowed legally to make decisions about slavery in any part of the United States. So this leads us into the election of 1860 with Abraham Lincoln because the people in the North who were against slavery and wanted it to end realized that they needed to get an anti-slavery president elected in order to start shaping what these Western states were going to look like and not allow slavery in those places. So that leads us here directly to Abraham Lincoln. Now, before the election of 1860, there was a new political party that had formed, and they were called the Republicans. The Republicans were mainly abolitionists, which meant that they did not believe in slavery. They wanted to get rid of it. And Abraham Lincoln was one of the first ones. In 1860, he was not very well known. He was from a little tiny town in Illinois. He had not been in politics before. He had tried to run for Senate, but had been beaten by somebody else. So he wasn't very well known. He personally didn't believe in slavery. He didn't think that that was a moral decision, but he didn't necessarily think slavery needed to end in the country. He just didn't want it to expand into those new Western territories. But as he started his run for president in 1860, he had some, interviews, and one of the quotes from one of the interviews is what made people in the South start to fear Lincoln. One of his quotes said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." So when he says a house divided against itself, he's meaning the country. The country is divided down the middle, half slave, half free, and he does not believe that the United States government can keep going forever half and half. He thinks it's going to have to be one way or the other. And of course, Abraham Lincoln didn't believe in slavery, so he believed that the entire country was going to have to embrace freedom and slavery was going to have to end. Now, because of this, the South immediately started to dislike Lincoln. This idea of that the country couldn't keep going half free and half slave goes against everything that they've been working for years. And so the South doesn't like Lincoln at all. So when the election of 1860 comes about, there's kind of a problem because the first thing is that we've got four guys running for president. Now, normally, if you remember, we only have two main people running for president, but in 1860, there were four guys. That's because the different sections of the country could not agree on who they wanted to run, and so they had too many candidates. Now, this too many candidates works out really well for Lincoln because what ends up happening is that the South votes for their guy, the North votes for Lincoln. The two other guys only have a small percentage of the country who vote for them. And so because the vote is split, Lincoln ends up winning pretty easily because he gets all of these red states up at the top, all these northern states and the two western states. So Lincoln wins in 1860. Now, here's the deal. This is really important because Lincoln was not even on the ballot in the southern states. When they were voting, Lincoln's name was not even one option that the southern states could choose. So the fact that he won was a really big deal. It also was a really scary deal for the South because the South thought that Lincoln winning meant that he was immediately going to try to end slavery. So the South wasn't happy. They were actually scared, terrified, angry that Lincoln had won. The North was thrilled. But as a result of Lincoln getting elected in 1860, a couple things happened. First thing is that people freak out in the South. South Carolina, especially, freaks out, and they thought that a Lincoln was going to end slavery, which would mean that all of them would immediately be poor because they wouldn't be able to afford to pay their workers to continue farming and doing their agriculture. And so they thought their only choice was to secede from the USA. Remember, that means to leave. So South Carolina said that they had the right to leave the United States based on states' rights, that they had chosen to join the USA, and therefore they have the right to choose to leave the USA. So in 1860, right after Lincoln's election, South Carolina secedes from the USA, so they leave. Now, this is not the first time that South Carolina had threatened to leave. They had tried a couple times before this. They had always threatened that if they didn't get their way, they would leave. So, but they officially did in 1860, and they based it on the idea that the Constitution was protecting slavery, that slavery was an important part of the South's economy, and because the North breached their contract, saying that they were going to stop trying to end slavery, that the South no longer had to stay in the USA, and that Lincoln would not protect their rights to their property, meaning their slaves, and that they were allowed to leave. So in 1860, South Carolina leaves. These are some of the headlines that were on the newspaper at the time. And South Carolina starts a streak or a break. And so, even though South Carolina is the first state, 7 other states eventually leave before Lincoln is even officially the president. And then 4 more states leave near his inauguration. So when we end in June of 1860, May of 1861, we have 11 states who have left the United States and formed a new country called the Confederate States of America. And this new country would elect its own president, get a new flag, get a new write a new constitution, do all of the things that they needed to do to start their own country. And because they left, and because of the secession, and because these red states and these green states now no longer were part of the USA, this is what will lead us into the Civil War. Now, Lincoln feels he has no other choice but to fight a war, not over slavery, not over states' rights, but over the idea that these states were legally not allowed to leave the United States, and he must fight a war to get them to come back. So this will start the Civil War, 1861, and it will continue to be fought until 1865.